The world of fashion stood still today. The runways went silent, the spotlights dimmed, and millions paused as the news broke. Giorgio Armani, the legendary Italian designer whose name defined elegance and sophistication for decades, has passed away. He was more than a fashion icon. He was a movement, a visionary who transformed the way the world saw style. And how style could empower. From the very first sketch he drew in a modest Milanese studio to the empire that now spans continents, Giorgio Armani built a world not just of clothing, but of identity. His work was not loud or flamboyant, it whispered confidence. It was sharp, clean, controlled. He gave us jackets that redefined masculinity, silhouettes that softened power with grace, and a neutral color palette that spoke louder than the brightest reds. Armani's genius lay in understanding people, not just their bodies, but their presence. He rose in a post-war Italy, where fashion was still recovering from the shadows of conflict. Armani didn't just step into the industry, he rebuilt it. In the 1970s, while the rest of the world was playing with disco excess and psychedelic chaos, Armani brought restraint, simplicity. He taught us that style was not about screaming, it was about knowing. And when he entered Hollywood, he didn't just dress stars, he sculpted legends. The moment Richard Gere appeared in American Gigolo wearing Armani suits, a new era was born. Suddenly, power looked polished. Success looked subtle. And designers around the globe began chasing a standard that only Giorgio had set. He didn't follow trends. He erased them, replacing fads with timelessness. Even as the years went on, Armani never faded. He remained fiercely in control of his brand, refusing to sell out or let others dictate what the Armani name stood for. That kind of authority in fashion, where change is constant, is unheard of. But then again, so was Giorgio Armani. Giorgio Armani was not born into privilege. He did not inherit luxury. He earned every thread of it. Born in Piacenza, Italy in 1934, his early life was marked by war, loss, and a world trying to rebuild itself. He studied medicine before turning to fashion, a choice that surprised even those closest to him. But perhaps that's what made his vision so sharp. He understood anatomy, form, and the subtle language of how people hold themselves. Fashion, to him, was never about fabric alone. It was about structure, dignity, silence that spoke louder. Then noise. In 1975, Giorgio launched his own label. Few believed it would last, but he didn't chase attention. He crafted presence. Within a few short years, his name echoed in fashion capitals around the globe. Armani didn't just sell clothes. He built an aesthetic, a philosophy. You knew an Armani piece when you saw it. The shoulders, the way it moved, the absence of excess. He dressed both men and women with a kind of equal elegance, removing gender lines from luxury. Women in Armani looked like they commanded boardrooms, not just parties. Men in Armani looked like they didn't need to prove anything. They just were. As fashion moved into the wild experiments of the 80s and 90s, Armani stayed the course. He never needed gimmicks. He didn't have to shock. Simply refined. He launched Emporio Armani for the younger generation. Armani exchanged for streetwear appeal and even took on the world of home interiors, perfumes, and hotels. But even as his empire grew, the signature remained. You could walk into an Armani store in Tokyo or New York and feel the same air, disciplined, poised, unmistakably Italian. Behind the scenes, Giorgio Armani was famously private. He guarded his personal life with the same precision he applied to his designs. No scandals, no chaos, just quiet mastery. A man whose power came not from how loud he was, but from how deeply he influenced everything around him. In Hollywood, Giorgio Armani became a silent kingmaker. His suits walked every red carpet, but he rarely stood in front of the cameras himself. Richard Gere in American Gigolo wore Armani and the world took notice. That single moment redefined men's fashion, not just for film, but for the public imagination. Suddenly, being elegant was masculine again. And when stars like Michelle Pfeiffer, Julia Roberts, Kate Blanchett graced award shows draped in his gowns, they didn't just wear dresses, they wore confidence. Kate became known in the industry. If you wanted to be taken seriously, you wore Armani. But Armani's impact extended far beyond celebrities and CEOs. In the corporate world, he shaped how professionals dressed globally. He created the idea of the power suit without saying a word. In politics, in diplomacy, in business, the Armani silhouette became a symbol not of wealth, but of presence. His tailoring wasn't just style, it was armor, silent, clean, sharp. He dressed presidents, he dressed rebels, he dressed people who didn't want attention but respect. Through it all, Giorgio Armani remained fiercely independent. Unlike many fashion houses, he never sold to a conglomerate. He retained ownership of his brand. Every decision, every expansion, every partnership was guided by his hand. In an industry where trends change by the hour, Armani remained timeless. He resisted fast fashion. He resisted noise, resisted compromise. Even in his final years, he remained involved in every collection. He would personally approve designs, adjust fabric, review fittings. At nearly 90, he was still attending shows, still overseeing photo shoots, still walking through factories. Not because he had to, but because he was the house. Armani wasn't a brand. It was him. His values. His discipline. His taste. Now the world looks at his legacy, not just in fashion, but in culture. In how he reshaped masculinity and femininity. In how he elevated simplicity. In how he taught an entire generation that elegance doesn't beg for attention, it commands it quietly, in private. Giorgio Armani was a man of restraint, mystery, and quiet strength. He rarely spoke of his personal life, preferring to let his work carry the weight of his identity. He never married. He had no children. Instead, his creations became his legacy, each garment a message to the world about the power of restraint and the meaning of control. But those close to him say he was deeply emotional. A man who poured his soul into fabric and stitching because it was the only language he fully trusted. His grief over the loss of Sergio Galati, his partner in life and business, was profound. Galati had died of AIDS in 1985, just as Armani's empire was expanding at full speed. Armani never truly recovered. He channeled the loss into discipline, into work, into silence. He never chased attention. He never relied on scandal to stay relevant. While others in the fashion world courted chaos, Armani stayed still, calm, focused. He believed in timelessness. While brands rebranded, relaunched, and reimagined, Armani remained rooted. The suits he designed in the 1980s are still worn today. The lines haven't changed much. That was the point. Trends were not his business, legacy was. Over time, he expanded his empire carefully. Armani Prive, his couture line. Armani Exchange for a younger crowd. Hotels in Milan and Dubai. Even a presence in interior design and hospitality. But always, under his control, always with intention. He once said, "Elegance is not about being noticed, it's about being remembered." And he was. By actors who trusted his eye. By world leaders who wore his suits to summits. By models who said his clothes made them feel powerful without shouting. He never shouted, but he was always heard. When news of his death broke, the industry fell silent. Social media exploded. With tributes, but none could fully express what he meant. Because Armani did not simply dress people, he reshaped the very idea of how we see ourselves. He proved that silence can be powerful, that dignity can be designed. That style, when true, does not need to explain itself. The world responded to Giorgio Armani's death not just with sadness but with reverence. Fashion houses across Paris, Milan, and New York dimmed their lights. Runways stood still. For a moment, the entire industry paused, as if time owed Armani a final bow. His flagship store in Via Monzon, Milan, became a shrine. People gathered, outside some laying flowers, others leaving handwritten notes, quiet. Tributes to a man who taught generations how to lead with elegance and never scream for attention. Designers, who once competed with him, now posted tributes filled with awe. Donatella Versace called him the father of discipline in Italian fashion. Tom Ford said Armani's restraint taught him more than any trend ever could. Even younger designers who had never met him admitted that his fingerprints were all over their first sketches. That is how far his influence reached past rivalries across eras, into the core of what fashion means. But his loss wasn't only felt in showrooms or studios. Celebrities, politicians, athletes, all those who had once stood on red carpets or world stages dressed in his creations came forward with memories. Michelle Obama, who once wore Armani at a state dinner, called him a master of understated power. Leonardo DiCaprio, who had been dressed by him for over 2 decades, said, "Wearing Armani wasn't just about looking good, it was about knowing who you were." Perhaps what made his impact so massive was how intimate it always felt. He designed not just for the body, but for the soul. His clothes didn't just drape, they whispered. They carried confidence in their silence and made the person inside feel like they had nothing to prove. He believed in empowering through simplicity, and in doing so, he gave people more than fashion. He gave them freedom. At his funeral, there were no extravagant theatrics. Just a simple ceremony in Milan, attended by family, longtime collaborators, models, and a few close celebrities. No cameras were allowed inside. That was his final wish. He never needed the lens to validate his life. The man who built a billion-dollar empire had nothing to prove. Even in death, he remained loyal to the values he championed: dignity, control, clarity, as the days passed after his funeral. The fashion world began to process the magnitude of what had been lost. Giorgio Armani was not just a man or a brand, he was an era. An entire generation of design philosophy was written in his handwriting, stitched with his signature grace, and built on his belief that luxury should never scream. His legacy stretched beyond fabric and runways. It wove into the cultural DNA of modern elegance. The Armani empire, now left in the hands of trusted executives and family members, issued a statement reaffirming its commitment to his vision. "We do not plan to evolve, we plan to preserve." It read. Armani had left detailed instructions for the brand's future, right down to the placement of accessories in store windows. His precision, even in absence, was unwavering. For him, legacy wasn't an idea, was a responsibility. Fashion critics, historians, and media outlets began reflecting on what set him apart. It wasn't just about creating clothes. It was about reshaping the very idea of power dressing. Armani didn't just design suits. He created armor for women entering boardrooms in the 1980s. He refined masculinity for actors who didn't want to look like peacocks but still wanted to make a statement. He was the silent tailor of confidence. But even more than that, Giorgio Armani was a story of discipline over indulgence. While others chased trends, he stood still and let the world revolve around his consistency. He didn't crave viral moments or headline chaos, and yet, time and time again, the spotlight found him because true elegance always does. A younger generation that had grown up in a louder, more chaotic fashion era began revisiting his archives. TikTok videos of his classic shows went viral. Gen Z stylists started pulling his vintage pieces for shoots. Suddenly, Armani's restraint felt rebellious again. In a world of overexposure, his calm was power. In a culture of noise, his silence was truth. Museums across the world began curating retrospectives. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York announced a special exhibit titled Armani, Quiet Power. And in Milan, plans were put in motion for a permanent memorial, not just for the man, but for the philosophy he embodied. even as the world settled into a future without Giorgio Armani walking among us. His presence remained impossible to ignore. Every time a sharply cut blazer turned a head on the street, every time a minimalist dress spoke louder than sequins ever could, it was him. He had trained the eyes of the world to appreciate understatement, and now the world could not unsee it. Fashion houses that once competed against him began to publicly acknowledge their debt. Rival designers, once protective of their own legacies, gave credit where it was long overdue. He didn't just create fashion, one noted, he gave it a conscience. Armani's influence wasn't a trend that would fade with a season, it was an ethic, a discipline, a worldview. Beyond the runways, his philanthropic work also began receiving new attention. Few knew how much he had quietly contributed to medical research, humanitarian efforts, and cultural preservation. Hospitals in Italy displayed plaques bearing his name, not because he asked them to, but because he had saved lives not with fabric, but with funding. Years before it was fashionable to be a philanthropic brand. His final interviews resurfaced. In one he had said, "Elegance is not about being noticed, it's about being remembered." Those words hit differently now, because Giorgio Armani wasn't loud, but the world couldn't forget him. His passing did not signal an end, clarified his eternal relevance. It reminded everyone that true class doesn't fade. It deepens, and as the Armani brand moved forward under the quiet guidance of those he had mentored for decades, there was no panic, no reinvention, no desperate pivot to keep up. Instead, there was a sense of calm stewardship. The ship he had built so meticulously would keep sailing, not with chaos or clamor, but with the same steady grace that had always defined it in the end. Armani didn't just leave behind a fashion empire. He left a blueprint for how to lead, how to endure, and most importantly, how to leave when the time is right, with dignity, clarity, and without a single button out of place.